This is my favorite guy of the 8 that Kansas has so far. I think, his versatility along the defensive line really shows up. He's a guy who can play both one gap. He can play as a nose tackle and be a two-gap type guy. He can be a two-gap guy down the line even. He did that at times at UAB. And he's somebody that if you said, hey, this is a guy that's tough to move off the ball, you'd be accurate, but you'd be underselling him.
Pay heed, all who enter, and beware of this podcast. That's right. This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. If you're new here, you should be doing 3 things. On our YouTube channel, you should subscribe at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. If you're on YouTube, you should also like the video and share a comment. You can also subscribe on audio, on our audio platforms, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Plenty of ways to connect with the show. We really appreciate those of you that have done that. We've just surpassed 1,400 subscribers on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. Let's get to 1,500. Why not? Well, or you know what? Shoot for the moon. 2,000. I don't care. Whatever. I'll keep setting goals.
If you guys want to push it to 10,000 or something, we won't stop you.
Exactly. And you'll definitely want to be subscribed on YouTube because that's where we do our YouTube live shows. We'll be doing more of those over the course of the spring after major KU basketball games. We'll be talking KU basketball, of course, as well later on this week after they play against TCU. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon, so they'll be playing tonight. We'll talk about that in a later episode. We'll have our breakdown of that coming up on the feed as well. But for today's show, huge news. Lots of things happening in the transfer portal for Kansas football. That's what we're going to be talking about for this episode. And KU got right to work, Kevin. It's been a busy past couple of days for the Jayhawks. We'll try to keep you as updated as possible as these things happen. Just know that, commits happen, things change, whatever it may be. We'll try to stay as up to date as possible. But today we're going to be talking about some of the players that are definitely committed to Kansas out of the transfer portal. This is kind of what we expected to happen, Kevin, right? Where, for so much of December, the news was bad. You had news of guys departing from KU and really across the country, players leaving, players intending to the transfer portal with no real recourse of saying, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And then sure enough, the floodgates open January 2nd. The portal is officially open for players to enter and also for players to start committing elsewhere. And sure enough, Kansas went right to work. And as of this recording on Tuesday early in the afternoon, 8 commitments for the Jayhawks. We're going to break them all down on this episode. Let's start with one of the biggest ones, both literally and metaphorically, probably for Kansas off the bat. And that's Texas offensive tackle Connor Stroh. 6'7", 340-pound offensive lineman. He started in 5 games for Texas this past season. He played in a total of 10 games, and Texas actually rotated him between guard and tackle. So he played both inside and outside. He is currently 24/7 Sports' second highest rated transfer for Kansas with a grade of 87. We'll get to the highest later on in the show. And for me, Kevin, this was significant because offensive tackle is a premium position. I think if you were to look at what would be considered like the most expensive, most important positions in the transfer portal, they're going to cost the most. Quarterback obviously is one. We've seen the reports with Brendan Sorsby and Sam Levitt making probably north of $5 million. Mestamaker got a pretty big deal as well to go to Oklahoma State. But then after quarterback, offensive tackle is probably pretty close up there in terms of next highest position. And so for me, my initial reaction is, hey, it's a premium position, and to lock it down early, I think is significant with a player with some upside, right? I think this is a guy that he spent 3 years at Texas, so he was a redshirt sophomore this season, so presumably 2 years of eligibility left. I think the biggest question for me, beyond this being a significant get for Kansas, just in terms of being a premium position, is can you, at this point in time, just sort of pencil Stroh in as a potential starter on the offensive line at the tackle position opposite Calvin Clemens? So what do you think of this pickup?
Do you want me to blow your mind right now, Nick?
I would love to have my mind blown, yes.
Connor Stroh has actually worked at center at times as well.
Really?
I mean, I thought Bryce Foster was the biggest center that I will probably ever see in my life, and Connor Stroh has actually worked some at center as well. And so when I'm looking at him, I don't think you pencil him in at tackle. I think there's the possibility he could bounce out at tackle. I would actually think, Nick, that he would be a really good guy to kind of finish out that interior group. When you look at Amir Herring, Tavake Tuikolovatu, those guys, I think you would have a really good interior. That's not to say he can't play tackle. Remember, Tavake got a shot at tackle before moving inside as well. I think he can play tackle. The weakness there, if you're looking at it, the thing that maybe isn't as strong about his game is the foot quickness. And so to me, when you look at the way that Kansas runs, like wide zone and things like that, the way you want guys to move and get out to angles, you may be looking for a little bit more agile guy in that tackle spot than Connor Stroh. But this is a guy, Nick, that made 24/7 Sports' Freaks list as a high school recruit. One, because he's humongous, obviously. But the other thing is the accompanying weight room numbers, right? When he was in high school, he was benching well over 400 pounds. When he was in high school, he was squatting almost 600 pounds. And so when you look at that stuff and say, hey, this is a 17-year-old guy or whatever doing these things in the weight room, that's something that's really, really attractive. And so I don't necessarily pencil him in and say, hey, your tackles are Calvin Clements and Connor Stroh, but I do think it's a possibility, hey, he could stick at that right tackle spot. But I think if you were to say handicap this thing, I would maybe put a little bit more on him going ahead and filling one of those guard spots. But there's the possibility he certainly plays that tackle spot.
Well, and on the interior, I think it's complicated a little bit by the fact that Kansas probably expected Tyler Mercer to be a guy that would be starting for them. And obviously was one of the players that ended up entering the transfer portal. So now you're looking at it and saying, okay, well, you have Amir Herring, who maybe might be your center at this point. You have Tavake, as you mentioned, but now you have another opening at the guard spot, obviously with Kobe Baines being gone from the program as well. So yeah, I think that also leads me to believe, Kevin, that maybe Kansas might not be done on the offensive line of the transfer portal. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they've got a few left. This is not going to be the only offensive line signing. And you think about in previous classes, Nick, there have been classes where KU's offensive line has looked mostly pretty good, and they've still gone out and gotten a couple guys kind of to get into the mix and whatever else. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they brought in a guy that's sort of a more classic tackle. They're obviously they're looking at Trezell Jenkins is a guy that I think is either visiting or getting ready to start his visit. He's an interesting guy, Nick, just because if you're a Chiefs fan, you know that name. His dad was Trezell Jenkins that the Chiefs took in the first round back in the 1990s, and so that's another one. And I think we may even be looking at a couple more after that, but it wouldn't surprise me to see them go out and get a quote unquote Enrique Cruz type, where it's, hey, you believe in this guy, got a lot of experience playing tackle, and you feel like you can plug and play him out there. And then if Connor Stroh makes it a tackle, great. And if he doesn't, you can have him there on the interior. And you think about Amir Herring really came a long way this year, really, closed the year playing well. If you move him to center, which is sort of his more natural position, the place that he sort of grew up playing, that's a pretty physical duo right next to each other when you want to run the football. And I think this is a KU team that's going to want to run the football, especially with Andy Kotelnicki coming back.
Pay attention to those visits, people. Pay attention to the visits. That's something to watch. Another position, Kevin, that obviously I think you and I had circled as being of crucial importance for Kansas, given some of the outgoing departures from that spot, linebacker, obviously.
Yes.
Right? And Kansas wasted no time getting aggressive at that position, bringing in a couple different guys. Let's start with Kentucky linebacker Landyn Watson. He is a 6'2", 240-pound linebacker, also an 87 grade in the 24/7 Sports transfer portal rankings, which, again, I would kind of take those with a grain of salt. It's kind of I don't know. Sometimes I think they just throw numbers out there, but just something to keep in mind as sort of maybe a little bit of a reference point. Landyn Watson has had quite the career. He started his career actually at Marshall. Started his career at TCU.
Yeah.
Actually, sometimes it's hard to check.
He was an LSU commit at one point, Nick. He was committed to LSU, signed with TCU, and then finish up the bio.
Yeah, sometimes it's these guys, in this era, people take crazy paths. Played 2 seasons at TCU in 2021 and 2022, but only played in a total of 3 games during that span. Then he went to Marshall to sort of try to prove it for himself in 2023. In 2023, didn't really play that much either, had just 4 tackles. 2024 was his breakout season, 65 tackles, an interception for Marshall that year. He parlayed that into transferring up to the SEC to Kentucky this past season, where he only had 21 tackles, but he did play in all 12 games for the Wildcats. And now with only 1 year of eligibility left in the transfer portal again, Kansas gets him. The first thing that stood out to me, Kevin, when looking at him is straight line speed downhill. I mean, big linebacker, feels like somebody that is going to be able to try to make some explosive plays, and Kansas is going to need some of that, obviously, right? Because not only are you replacing your entire linebacking core, but Bengali Kamara was a guy that made several key plays in several key games and arguably helped you win the UCF game this season. So you want to get some playmakers at the linebacker spot. Landyn Watson, a guy that's been a bit of a journeyman, but what do you think of this pickup?
Yeah, and when you look at what DK McDonald wants to do, right, Bengali Kamara played both off the ball and kind of on the ball as almost like a defensive end type of player, an edge guy. And Landyn Watson can do both. And I think that's the thing that makes this a really attractive guy. You mentioned him playing downhill in the run game, and I agree that's a major strength of his. I also think, though, Nick, that this is a linebacker who can give you some boost in the pass rush. And we've seen from DK, he doesn't necessarily just want to send 4 guys and, hey, that's how I'm living. If he's sending 4, maybe he's dropping an end. Maybe he's sending a linebacker. Maybe he's, sending a safety, and he's doing different things to try and create confusion. And Landyn Watson is a guy that was a high school defensive end. And when you watch the tape, the way that he uses his hands is how he won. He was a good athlete, good size, but he was somebody that when he was blocked, he wasn't blocked. He could get off of blocks incredibly well because of the hand usage. And so when you look at, hey, it's 3rd and 8 and Landyn Watson's on the field, you can either sneak him up to the line and play sort of that edge spot like you did with Bengali Kamara, or you can have him in the middle of your defense, send him on a blitz and know that, hey, even if he gets picked up, he's somebody that's not going to stop working and he's going to give you a chance to maybe get home. And so I really like this a lot. Landyn Watson's a really good football player. I think that's his main strength is, you talk about he's got good size, like you said, the downhill speed is there. I just think he's really good at football, and Kansas could certainly use some of those guys in that linebacker room. Guy that, can help stop the run, can bump down, can rush the passer, can do a lot of different things. And so I really like this pickup a lot.
Well, and Kansas knew you would need multiple linebackers with how depleted that room was. So they went out and got another one in New Mexico State linebacker Quincy Davis. From New Mexico State, spent 3 seasons there in Las Cruces, 6'1", 230 pounds. In 2024, he was a bit more of a rotational linebacker after he redshirted his previous season. I had 19 total tackles in 2024. This past season, his role was bigger as a starter, and he had 43 total tackles in 12 games, including 11 tackles alone in the game against New Mexico. And the reason I would point that out is because obviously that's a quarter of the tackles for his season, but New Mexico, that's a rivalry game, which means that this is the type of player that maybe you could expect to turn up in big games potentially from New Mexico State. With Davis, Kevin, I don't know about you. This one feels to me a little bit more like some additional depth. I don't know if he's somebody that you can just pencil in as having a huge role for Kansas in 2026, but linebacker was a big position of need for Kansas, and this is a guy that adds to that room.
Did you say Quincy Davis? His name's Quincy Davis? It's weird because I had like this buzzing. I thought you said Joe Sip.
Oh,
because Quincy Davis, I think you watch the tape and there are so many similarities there, right? Physically, he doesn't really jump off the page as like, oh my gosh, look at this guy. I think he's really, really good between the tackles. He doesn't miss tackles. He's really good against the run, and he's got great instincts, Nick. And when you watched him play against some of their like best competition, there were times that he didn't always get off blocks, and that was a Joe Sip thing as well. And I'm not knocking him down. We're trying to give you a full and complete picture of these guys, and that's something that you can continue to work on it and develop. But I think that if you were wondering, hey, what would Joe Sip have done if he had come back to school this year? Quincy Davis might give you a pretty good look at that. I know we would have loved to see Joe Sip this year, had the injuries and all of those things. And I'm not saying he's strictly that guy, but I think he checks a lot of the same boxes. And I think, another guy that instinctually is really, really good. Fills against the run well, is a thumper. Like when he arrives angry. That was something that you saw with Joseph as well. And so I do see a lot of similarities between the two of them. Now, last year, Joseph was hurt. Kansas kind of found its two-ish guys and didn't really rotate as much as maybe you would have hoped, maybe because of that Joseph injury. Like you were saying, Quincy Davis is a guy, if he comes in, he beats somebody out, great. If not, I do think that he gives you some really solid depth in that room, and another guy that you can build around and you can put him out there on the field and not feel bad about him being out there at all.
Kevin, did Kansas recently get a South Carolina linebacker who turned out to be pretty impactful? I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
Feels that way. I wish I could remember it. Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe not. But anyways, they got another South Carolina linebacker. We'll see how this one turns out. They got 3 linebackers committed with Watson, Davis, and then the third one is Jaron Willis from South Carolina, a former 4-star recruit, 4th-year linebacker. He was at South Carolina for 3 years after he started his career at Ole Miss. Didn't play at Ole Miss, went to South Carolina. Now, Kevin, something I found a little bit interesting here is that on South Carolina's website, they list him at 6'2", 235. 24/7 Sports has him listed at 254 in the transfer portal. So that's a pretty big gap, discrepancy in terms of weight. So something to potentially keep an eye on there. This is a guy that hasn't really played much in his career to this point. He appeared in 11 games this past season with 7 tackles, but was a pretty big special teams guy for South Carolina, actually. And in fact, South Carolina voted him as one of their best special teams players in spring football in 2025 before this season. And this is the guy that I think, Kevin, pretty much fits perfectly part of the model. I want to talk a little bit about this more later on in the show. It's sort of, I think with all these transfers, you can really break them into 3 separate categories. One of those categories is being a former high-level recruit who's talented, but hasn't really had a chance to play for various reasons, whatever they may be, and now having a chance to come to Kansas and maybe prove it. And that's where I think Willis kind of slots in. Spent several seasons at different SEC schools, hasn't really had his chance to be fully just, be the guy, right? And now he has a chance potentially to come to Kansas and maybe be that guy. We'll see how things unfold for him, but this is a guy that feels like somebody that could have a high ceiling for Kansas.
Scored a touchdown this past year, Nick. I actually playing defense, and I think in 23 had sort of a sack forced fumble where it was his teammate kind of grabbed a hold of the quarterback and he came in and smashed the quarterback. Ball came out. You're absolutely right, and we talked before, and I know we're bumping up against breaks, so I'll try not to go too far into it. But one of the categories that Kansas typically does is, hey, this is a power 4 guy that's not playing, but he used to be a really high-level recruit, and we'll see what we can get out of him. And sometimes, for whatever reason, it doesn't work out, whether it's injury or another reason. And sometimes you get Emmanuel Henderson, and, Emmanuel Henderson being a first-team All-Big 12 return guy, having 750 or whatever it was receiving yards, you can find those guys. He had 5 career catches at Alabama before he came to Kansas, had 45 this past year. And so I think you're absolutely right, and that's a lot of what this is. You watch the tape on this guy, and you can see the speed. You can see why he was a highly regarded guy, because he can really, really move. And so if you want somebody that can get sideline to sideline, if he picks up the nuances of football, and that's something that Chris Simpson is so keen on. And part of the reason we've talked on the show about how it's very tough a lot of times for linebackers to sort of play to their peak potential in year one is because they're still putting that whole package together. But he's somebody that if he puts that stuff together, Kansas could wind up being the best of the bunch of Kansas's linebackers if he comes in, works, really studies, and gets to where he needs to be from a football IQ standpoint. Athletically, you see why he's a 4-star.
Yeah, I mentioned that sort of categories and that you can break most of these transfers into. When you look at the linebackers and what they've done so far with Kansas, I think you can see all 3 categories.
Yeah.
Got the talented guy that hasn't played a ton, but maybe has a high ceiling in Jaron Willis. You got a proven sort of, power 4 starter or power 4 player in terms of Landyn Watson. And then you got the G5 guy that is going to take a step up and maybe can offer you something as well with Quincy Davis. So you kind of see the vision potentially for all three of those players and what they could bring to KU. Just real quick, I'll ask you this: 3 linebackers already committed for Kansas. Is that enough? Do you think maybe you look for another, or is that good?
2 more, I think. I really think they're going to get 2 more, and so this is where things become challenging when you have those big numbers. And we talked about that, I think, last football episode. Is it wasn't necessarily going to be difficult for Kansas to make a splash and go out and get guys. The challenge is going to be when you're getting that 4th guy, when you're getting that 5th guy, how are you able to get those guys and convince them, hey, come here, you have an opportunity. Even though we've brought in these other guys, this is still the right place for you. And so this is where Rob Ianello and the coaching staff and those guys are really going to start to earn their money. It is going to linebacker 4, linebacker 5, safety 3, safety 4, like we've talked about, and saying, hey, you have every opportunity here to be the guy too, and having them believe you when you say that. And to be fair, Kansas has been really good in terms of keeping competitions open and letting guys really, the best guy play. And so this is a position that'll be interesting because I still think they're going to take 1 or 2 guys here.
The emphasis for Kansas early in the transfer portal, Kevin, has pretty clearly been on the defense. A couple of guys on the defensive line that have also committed to KU that we'll talk about next. But there's also one exciting offensive player that I'm looking forward to talking about as well. We'll do all that coming up next. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your #1 source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
Success in real estate takes more than vision. It takes the right financial partner. When someone takes something rundown and turns it into something great, that's called a comeback story, like Brain Group. They take distressed properties here in KC, completely rework them, and then turn them into valuable real estate. But that kind of work needs the right bank behind it. Enter Emprise Bank. They're not about cookie-cutter loans. They saw Brain Group's vision, backed them, and now they're making big moves in Kansas City real estate. Talk about your partner impossible. Emprise doesn't do one-size-fits-all financing. They invest in potential and back growth. Visit emprisebank.com/KC to learn more. Emprise Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. If you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe on audio platforms, Apple and Spotify, and on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN on YouTube, where you can like the video and subscribe to the channel and also share a comment. Let us know which guy maybe you're excited about or most fired up about for Kansas so far early in this transfer portal cycle. Kansas has 8 commits, so that means we got a couple more guys to talk about here, Kevin, that have come on board for KU. The next guy that I want to talk about, Kevin, is maybe my favorite. I know we talked about Connor Stroh to begin the show, which I'm very excited about as a big dude, but maybe one of my favorite guys is UAB defensive lineman Eamon Smalls. And make no mistake about it, his name may be small, but this guy is big. 6'2", 310-pound interior defensive lineman. He spent the last 3 seasons at UAB. This past season in 2025, he started in 10 games. And something that we talked about previously with Quincy Davis, and maybe something to keep an eye on with some of these, group of 5 guys, is pay attention to what they've done against higher level competition. Well, Eamon Smalls had, Kevin, maybe the best game of his season in 2025 with his most tackles when UAB played Tennessee. They're only Power 5, the only Power 4 opponent. So this is a guy that I'm excited about. What do you see for when you look at Eamon Smalls?
Yeah, you mentioned in the comments people leaving, who their favorite guy is, and I'm right here with you. This is my favorite guy of the 8 that Kansas has so far. I think his versatility along the defensive line really shows up. He's a guy who can play both one gap, he can play as a nose tackle, and be a 2-gap type guy. He can be a 2-gap guy down the line even. He did that at times at UAB, and he's somebody that if you said, hey, this is a guy that's tough to move off the ball, you'd be accurate, but you'd be underselling him, Nick, because I do think that there's some playmaker in there. There's him being able to hold up, sort of against the cavalry charge, if you will, but then he also is somebody that can get off blocks and make plays. And you saw that against Tennessee. There were times against Tennessee that Tennessee ran the ball right at him and had two guys double teaming him, and he was holding up pretty well against that team. There were other times where he was blocked by one guy and he sheds the block and makes a tackle. And so I think when you look at him with this Kansas defensive tackle group, and we'll talk a little bit later in the show because there's another guy I know both of us really like that Kansas is in there with. You're looking for somebody who can play with Blake Harrell, because Blake Harrell, I think, has all Big 12 potential. And Blake Harrell is going to move up and down the line. We saw him play some defensive end, sort of a year ago. We saw him play more of a 3-tech type spot. And I really like the versatility here. But beyond that, Nick, if you're looking for a nose tackle to fill the quote-unquote Keenan Caldwell role, he's kind of similar in that I think he can hold up at the point of attack in a similar way that Keenan did, but also Keenan made a lot of big plays this year. And I think that when you look at Smalls, he's somebody that also has that potential to make those kinds of plays, to get off of blocks, to stop a running back for a loss or for no gain. And so I'm really excited to see him in the system. Jim Panagos' room looking pretty good when you look at some of the other guys he's looking at. When you look at Blake Harrell, Marcus Calvin, getting Cheese Hammond coming up, and a guy that we're going to speak about here pretty quickly as well too.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions I asked you. I texted you about Eamon Smalls when he committed, and basically kind of asking, okay, great, what does this mean potentially for Kansas in terms of what kind of front they may be working with going into 2026? Because I think that was one of the things that we kind of saw with the DK McDonald defenses. There was a lot of shifting of the front up front for Kansas over the course of the year. You saw defensive ends, Leroy Harris and Dean Miller playing very wide technique. You saw changes in the front. So what do you see with what KU's doing so far that maybe tells you about what they maybe want to continue to do or change with their front heading into 2026?
I think it's going to be the same. And I think you see that from Smalls. I think you see that from the next guy that we're going to talk about, not to ruin that one. But I think when you look at those pieces, what they have coming back, Nick, when we started the season, obviously I do sort of my tape breakdowns and things of that nature. And I was breaking down the Fresno State game. It was shocking to me, to say the least, to see all of the different fronts and looks that they gave Fresno State to sort of be like, oh, you're facing a traditional 4-man front here, but oh, wait a minute, there's Leroy Harris lining up almost as a slot corner. Now you're showing a 5-man front that's more of a traditional. It's not exactly a bear front, but basically KU's version of a bear front. They were showing a lot of different things, and they like to be able to move guys around it and do different things with them. I think Smalls helps with that. If you're going to go with a 4-man front, he can do that. If you want to play a 4-man front where it's an over front and you want him to be a nose tackle, you can do that. If you want to play sort of that bear front where you have Keenan Caldwell directly over the center, Smalls can be that guy too. And I like him a lot as a player, but I also like that versatility and the ability to play different spots within that defensive tackle group.
Another guy on that defensive line that's actually already been committed for a while. We haven't really officially fully talked about him, but that's D2 defensive lineman Jibriel Conde, who's been committed since early December, actually. I remember with the transfer portal, from the guys from the lower level, it worked a little bit differently with how things worked. So they actually got that commitment several weeks ago. But he also is another guy, not quite as big as Smalls, but certainly still adds depth to that room. And Kevin, the one thing I'll just say before I hand it back over to you about Conde is I don't think there's any position really on the field where you can't have too many players. That's how I feel about the defensive line and defensive tackle specifically. Like if you have enough depth there to be able to constantly rotate fresh bodies and keep pressure on the offense, on your opposing offensive line, like that's significant. So I'm all for adding more guys. Conde's a guy that's been committed for a little bit from the D2 level. And one other thing I'll just add is the last D2 guy that Kansas got from the trenches. Dominic Pooney, who has gone on to be a starter for the San Francisco 49ers.
He's all right.
And been really good. Yeah, been really, really good. So, but tell us a little bit more about Conde and maybe what you expect maybe from him.
Yeah, Conde's versatility jumps out too. That's one of the sort of top bullet points when you look at Conde is the versatility. But he's different from Smalls in that Smalls is going to play either a nose tackle or a traditional defensive tackle spot and can play either. Conde's a guy that can play defensive tackle and then play out on the edge. So he's got the Blake Harrell thing where you can put him at both spots. And I think that's interesting because I do like Marcus Calvin, but I think Calvin is more of sort of that traditional 3 technique as he continues to build. And so I don't necessarily love him as much bumping out to, a 4-eye, a 5, wherever you wind up having him. I think Conde can do that. And so Conde is more combination, strong side and defensive tackle. And so the fact that they went out and got Conde in December, and you mentioned it, Division II is the Wild West. Like, there is no portal. It just doesn't exist. So guys can come and go as they please. If you're transferring down to Division II, you don't need to be in the portal. If you're transferring out of D2, you should maybe leave somebody a note or something so they can find you. But you don't have to enter the portal either. And so when they got Conde back, I think in December, the main thing I thought was, okay, this is another guy that can do what Blake Harrell did a year ago. Because Blake Harrell was doing a lot. He was asked to do a lot. And you wanted him on the field because he's really good. But it would be nice to have another guy who could do those same things and fill those same roles. And I think Conde can really do that. He's got great length, too, when you watch him on tape. And I think that's something that he continues to work with Jim Panagos and works on getting off of blocks and the different things that Panagos does with those guys. That's a position group that Kansas has seen a lot of growth from guys over their times at Kansas. Conde could wind up becoming a real player on the other side of this thing.
Well, Kevin, you mentioned earlier in the show that you expect Kansas to want to run the ball quite a bit in 2026. Well, it would have been hard to do that with their current running back room because no more Daniel Highshaw, no more LeSean Williams, Harry Stewart departed the program. So you knew Kansas was going to be looking for some running backs in the transfer portal. They do have one already in the fold in the form of Jalen Dupree, running back out of Colorado State. He's a true sophomore. He spent 2 seasons at Colorado State, played in 5 games in 2024 as a freshman. As a sophomore in 2025, he played as the primary back, basically, averaged 5 yards per carry, 508 yards for the season. He had 6 games with double-digit carries, including a game in which he had 16 carries for 103 yards against San Diego State. Mentioned when talking about Eamon Smalls, looking at what they did against potentially playing against higher level competition. Colorado State played one power forward opponent this season. It was Washington. Washington obviously is maybe not what they had been the past couple seasons, but he had 15 carries, 92 yards, and a touchdown against Washington. That was the first game of the season for Colorado State when he had that performance. His production did kind of taper off through the second half of the season. Finished the year with the game with 56 yards against UNLV. Also had 12 receptions for 83 yards on the year for Colorado State. So not a huge threat, I guess, as a receiver. He's 6 foot, 210 pounds. So you're talking about more probably of a bit of a bruising type running back for Kansas. And I don't expect KU to be done by any means at this position, but if you were talking about a guy maybe that could be somebody you could lean on potentially as a physical runner, Dupree checks some of those boxes.
Kansas has a type, right? I think you and I talked about that in fall camp when we were out there at practice and watching the running back room and the guys going through. It's like Kansas absolutely has a running back type that they go for. They want that guy who's 210 pounds, has a little bit of burst to him. He doesn't have to be a track guy, but is somebody that, is a one-cut guy. And what you mean by that is you're not looking for a guy that's a dancer, right? When you're running wide zone, which is what they run. Think about the old Denver Broncos teams. I'm sorry, I know this is a Chiefs channel, but the Denver Broncos are one of the teams that really stand out from a zone running standpoint. And Terrell Davis, being a bigger back and then just sort of putting his foot in the ground and getting through the hole that he finds. And this is another one in that box, Nick. And I think that's one of the things that you like about him when you watch him on tape is there isn't the dancing. He is very decisive. And things like that, everybody wants to hear like, oh, this guy is 240 pounds and runs 4.3. Having vision and being decisive a lot of times are the difference between a running back being really effective and being a guy that looks really good in his pads and isn't nearly as good. And so when you look at what Kansas had coming back, and I think both of us really liked Harry Stewart, and thought, hey, if he continues to develop, he could have a role here. I think Dupree kind of fills that spot in terms of being that one cut back. He's going to be physical. He's going to put his foot in the ground, get downhill. And if you assume that, hey, Kotelnicki's going to add some option back into it, you're going to have wide zone, you're going to have option, you're going to have things where you don't want your running back to, try and cut all the way back across the field. You're going to want him to put his head down and get what he can. And I think this is a really good pickup from this standpoint. And it wouldn't surprise me if Dupree was a guy that winds up, quote unquote, outplaying whatever his transfer rating winds up being, just because he's going to be somebody that could potentially have that opportunity and is a good fit within the Kansas offense.
Well, and also I think it helps at the running back spot that you have guys that are fresh, and Dupree had just 102 carries this last season for Colorado State. So he's a guy that you also, if you wanted to, you probably could just feed him the ball quite a bit at that running back spot and let him kind of, do his thing. 5 yards of carries, really strong at Colorado State. So I think it's a strong add. Again, I think it's a position where you expect to add more. You want to add a little bit more depth there and maybe other guys that can contribute. But yeah, I'm excited for Jalen Dupree.
You put this in the notes, Nick, and you've been talking about it with each guy, how you perform against top competition. What did Dupree do against Washington?
Yeah, he had a big game, 15 carries, 92 yards, and a touchdown. I only had 2 touchdowns on the year, but one of them came against Washington in that one game against the Power 4 team. And again, Washington probably maybe not what they had been. Obviously, a couple years ago they were national title game. Probably they're obviously not the same this past season, but still, it's Power 4 competition, and it's something that I think is worth noting. One final guy really quick that we'll talk about, and then we'll take another quick break and talk about what's next for Kansas and other things. But one final commit that came in on Monday is Georgia safety Jaden Harris. He started his career at Miami, went to Georgia this past season, ended up not really playing as much, but he was pretty good at Miami, actually, especially as a man coverage guy. Our friend Derek Johnson had a little bit of a nugget on Jaden Harris playing man coverage at Miami in 2024. Now he comes to Kansas, and this is a guy that obviously when you're at the programs that he's been at, high-level player you would expect, and again, probably falls into the same category as Jaron Willis. But I will say with Harris specifically, I think you can expect more from him because of the fact that he has played a little bit more and seems to be a little bit more proven as a player. So, you think about Lyric Rawls departing the program for Kansas. Harris feels like he's a guy that maybe slots into that position.
Yeah, and he can rush the passer from the secondary too, which is an interesting trait because Kansas has gotten a lot out of that when they've had that. When you look at Marvin Grant was one of Kansas's best pass rushers, and I realize DK is running a different system, but he still sent guys out of the secondary, right? Think about the Arizona game and Jalen Todd and the game that Jalen Todd had rushing the passer there. And so I do think this is one of the more intriguing fits because I know Harris struggled to tackle at Miami. I mean, that's going to be the thing that people are going to talk a lot about, was he had a lot of missed tackles the year that he was a main starter there. I think he had 40 tackles, missed like 15 of them. And when you look at that tackling grade, it wasn't great. You can get better as a tackler, and you can work on a lot of those things. But the ability to cover from potentially an in-the-box spot, like you said, Kansas didn't have that a year ago. And that was a big part of the reason the defense really struggled, was the secondary really struggled to defend, especially when the safeties got called into man coverage. And so having somebody who can handle that part of it is a good piece to have. I'm interested to see if the rest of everything kind of catches up, if the tackles catch up, if he can get there as a run defender, if he's going to be a guy that's potentially going to be in the box. And then I think, too, are they going to be able to use him in certain packages to try and pressure the quarterback from the secondary? Because I do think that's something he does pretty well.
Yeah, the coverage thing is big because that was an area where Lyric Walls, quite frankly, struggled. You have flashbacks to the Cincinnati game where Kansas really had a hard time against Cincinnati, especially from the safety position. So, that could be big if he's a little bit more on the coverage side. But then, like you said, do you lose something that Lyric Rawls gave you this past season in terms of downhill, big pop, big hits, in the run game? There might be a little bit of having to strike a balance there in terms of what Kansas may want to do in the secondary. But yeah, from a coverage perspective, I think this is an upgrade, I would say, at this point. I guess we'll see going forward for Harris, but certainly a guy, again, potentially with some upside, I would say, in the back half of the defense. So that gives Kansas 8 total commits. We covered them all as we record this early on Tuesday afternoon. We'll take a quick break. We'll talk about some other news and notes from these guys and also what's next for Kansas in the transfer portal. We'll do that coming up next.
Hey, what's happening, people? It is Benny Heiss, KCSN betting analyst. And while the Chiefs may not be in the playoffs, that doesn't mean there is not plenty of action to go around for the rest of you that are still crazy fans of the National Football League. And with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL, it makes every playoff moment feel bigger. So whether you're looking at individual matchups in the wild card or for a possible Super Bowl matchup or for futures come postseason time, DraftKings has your back, and they also have your back with early exit protection. If the player in your eligible NFL prop goes down at any point in the first half, guess what? You can still get paid in cash. What an opportunity. What a way to be able to enjoy the playoffs and not worry about anybody that you include in those props going down, especially early on, and ruining the rest of all of your legs. So here's what you do. You download the DraftKings Sportsbook app, use the code KCSN, that is code KCSN, to turn $5 into $300 in bonus bets if your bet wins. In partnership with DraftKings, the crown is yours. Remember, if you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. New York, call 8778-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY. Connecticut, call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino in Kansas, wager tax pass-through may apply in Illinois. You must be 21 plus in most states. Void in Ontario. Restrictions apply. Bet must win to receive bonus bets which expire in 7 days. Minimum odds required. For additional terms and responsible gaming resources, see dkng.co/audio. Limited time offer.
This is the paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty, brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. Once again, if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Subscribe, especially at this time of year because you got the transfer portal chaos. We're going to be talking a lot about that and also Kansas basketball starting conference play as well. So please subscribe. Apple and Spotify on audio and also on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. We so appreciate those of you that have already done so. And if you haven't, again, it takes one click. You can also like the video and share a comment, share your thoughts, share your favorites. Is it Eamon Smalls? Is it Connor Stroh? Is it Dupree? Somebody else? One of the linebackers? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are as well in the comments. And we appreciate those of you that do join in on the conversation. So Kansas has 8 guys in the fold. Busy couple of days on the heels of the transfer portal opening. Still a lot of work to be done, though, I think, for Kansas. Yep. One quick thing I will say before we kind of dive into what might be next for the Jayhawks is I think when you look at the majority of these guys that Kansas already has in the fold, of the 8 players they have, a lot of them have multiple years of eligibility remaining. And that is something that I think Kansas is paying attention to and maybe even prioritizing in certain situations of getting guys that not just are going to potentially offer something in 2026, but beyond, right? Guys that you hope will stick around and blossom under the program. And I think that's a little bit of the recipe for what Kansas needs, quite frankly, Kevin, because I don't think this is a program that just can go out and afford to pay 1-year mercenary type players year in and year out. You're going to need to be able to get some guys. You're going to need to get some guys that you from the high school level that you recruit that develop. But then B, if you supplement that with guys that you get in from the transfer portal with a couple years remaining, that can offer you something for several years. I think out of the guys that Kansas already has committed, I'm looking at Jalen Dupree, the running back from Colorado State. I'm looking at Connor Stroh, the offensive lineman from Texas that has several years remaining. I think even Eamon Smalls has a couple years remaining potentially as well. So there's some guys in there that I think you start to think about offering even more for the future. So that's something to keep in mind, I think, as Kansas continues to move through this portal cycle. Let's talk about what's next for KU because, there were several positions in there that Kansas clearly prioritized very heavily. When you talk about linebacker getting 3 commits, defensive line, interior in the defensive line getting a couple commits, Connor Stroh at the tackle spot. But there are several positions there where I think, Kevin, there hasn't really been a ton of movement that I would be keeping my eyes open for potential opportunities for Kansas. First and foremost, I think wide receiver is a position where we're going to start to see Kansas really pivot to and look for a couple guys there, because you got Cam Pickett back, which I am excited about. You're excited about. I think most people are fired up about that one. You have Keaton Quebeca, but you'd like to find some additional playmakers at that position. And we talked a lot about the defensive tackle spot. Pay attention maybe to defensive end too for Kansas, because of the fact that basically who your guys are going to be starting wise. You got Leroy Harris, you got Dak Brinkley, but maybe some extra depth there would be something to keep an eye on as well. And then with running back, I mentioned they're probably still going to be looking for more running backs. You think that Kansas is going to take 2 more linebackers as well. So there's still lots to pay attention to for Kansas in the transfer portal, despite the fact they've already got 8 commits. I mean, we're talking about Kevin probably ending up in the 20-ish ballpark range for total players for Kansas. So if you want to think about it from that perspective, Kansas is basically, 40% done with their portal. So they still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and Chris Hummer, actually, while we were on this episode, because the portal never sleeps, put out that Stanford offensive tackle Jack Lehrer is going to visit. And we were talking about how does Connor Stroh sort of fit in that group. Lehrer has played different spots. He's played both tackle spots. He also played inside a little bit. But Lehrer, I feel like, is kind of one of those classic, like, plug-and-play tackles, right? If you brought in a guy like that, you could count on him probably to start at one of your tackle spots. He's got 18 career starts, started 12 games in 2024, missed this last year with an injury. And so that's kind of why he's available and out there. But yeah, you're going to go up and down the roster and find that they need to add guys. And that's where I think your point about multiple years of eligibility is so well made, is we're sitting here talking about the linebackers, for instance. All 5 of those linebackers probably aren't going to be starting guys. I don't see them running like a 3-5 or something like that. And so what you can do to fill out your numbers, but at the same time, not maybe put as much pressure on yourself, is get somebody that has 3 years of eligibility left, where you come in and you say, hey, come in, you're probably going to be in the rotation this year. We're going to really count on you the year after that. And it's hard to build that way in today's portal society, because guys don't want to stick around if they aren't playing, and they want starting guarantees and all of the different things that go along with that. But it's still the way that KU has to build, because KU is not going to be one of those teams that goes out there and just drops absolute briefcases of money overall. They're going to play money ball, and they're going to try and get guys who are undervalued when compared to what their value is going to be at Kansas. You talked a little bit about the transfer grades earlier this episode. Those are grades in a vacuum, right? And that's the way they grade them, is we're not looking where this guy is going. We're just saying, this is how good this guy is. Well, as we know, so often, so much is about fit and how you're utilized and all of the things there. So KU may get a guy who's an 87, but KU, he's asked to play to his strengths, and so he really plays like a 93, and so on and so forth. And that's something that KU is looking at that the people who do the portal rankings are not looking at. They're just straight up looking at, hey, how good is this guy in a vacuum? But that's not the way you recruit. That's not the way you portal shop. And so when you look at wide receiver, like we talked about, I think it's really interesting position, because Kotelnicki played 5, basically, when you look at the 3 starters, the triplets, if you want to call them that. And then you had Wilson, and you had Emilian.
He took Emilian. Yeah.
And so those were kind of your 5 guys. Well, right now you've got 2. And I think they're feeling like one of those needs to come from, the guys that they have on roster. Could it be a freshman? Could it be a Tyron Parker? Could it be a Tate Nagy that maybe slips in there? Does Jackson Cook take a step forward? Do you have Jaden Nickens healthy? Maybe you can have one of those guys hop in, but you're counting on 2 guys coming in from the portal, and you really not just want Nick, you really need both of those guys to hit. And so on one hand, you say, well, you're only taking 2 wide receivers in the portal compared to some of these other positions where you're taking a whole bunch of guys. But I wouldn't be surprised if the expenditure at wide receiver is maybe higher than it is at, say, linebacker, where you're taking 5 guys, but you're not necessarily shelling out just an absolute ton for a guy. You may shell out quite a bit to try and go find a number one wide receiver in this portal. That may be a position where you're spending a little bit more because you absolutely need those guys to hit.
Well, and something else to keep in mind is I've thought about this, Kevin, in terms of the timeline of the portal, right? It's open until January 16th. I think what you're going to see is a bit of an inverse relationship between the portal opening and and as we progress. And what I mean by that is floodgates have been open for the past couple of days, right, over the weekend. And we've seen that. Tons of players, right? Thousands of players in the portal, taking visits, committing, so on and so forth. Teams quickly getting guys in. Kansas obviously already with 8 commits. As this process continues to unfold and the market starts to get smaller and teams maybe start to get more desperate, that puts the leverage back in the hands of the players, where it may cost you more on January 15th to get a player than it maybe would have cost you on January 7th to get that same player. So it's something else to keep in mind, I think, as this unfolds, is that the market's going to change very rapidly, and leverage will start to shift as we get further into this process, more towards players in terms of, hey, look, I know there's not very many spots left, and I know that you desperately need this position. Here's my asking price. And it's X number higher than it would have been 4 days ago, 5 days ago. So, this is how quickly this process is moving. And so that's something else to consider, I think, when you're Kansas, because you talk about KU playing Moneyball and how important that is financially for them. That's gonna be a big factor as this thing moves forward, is that, the market's going to start to shift. Players are going to start to have a little bit more leverage and ability to ask maybe for more money, because they know that there's not as many options in the portal as there may have been on January 4th, right? If there may be, let's say, 500 receivers in the portal, just for an example, on January 6th as we record this. On January 10th, there may be only 300. On January 15th, there may only be, 175. So that it's going to change so quickly. So that's something that I've really been kind of thinking about as well, is just how quickly, the market can shift, potentially against you or in favor of you if you're Kansas, 4 players making more versus 4 players making less. So we'll see how it unfolds, but that's something that I've kind of had on my mind.
Yeah, 100%. It's supply and demand, right? And if you're defensive end 7 and it's January 6th as we're recording this, and you're defensive end 7, and you come to somebody with your price and they say, well, there are 6 better defensive ends than you, like, we're not going to pay you that amount. You fast forward to January 15th, 1 through 6 have all signed, and all of a sudden, you're on the phone with Auburn or whoever, and they're like, we want to pay you defensive end 7 money. And you say, no, I'm defensive end 1 now. Those other guys are not available to you. It is me, or you are looking down the line. And that's a great point, that as this thing goes on, you really do see that kind of the desperation shift more toward the schools. Because remember, we've talked about this before, the 16th is just the deadline to enter. Yes. So players can hold out longer than that if they feel like, hey, I don't have an offer, but schools are wanting to get these guys in for the spring semester, all those things. So even as you get on to, you can still land a guy on the 17th or the 18th if they're already in the portal. But at what point are they, staring you right in the eye and they're saying, I've got other offers. I'm the only defensive end you want. Like, you're going to meet my asking price. And so I think being as active and proactive as Kansas has been is a really positive sign in this class. That's not going to say that they aren't going to get caught in a bidding war somewhere, or they won't have to spend more than they want to at a certain spot, but it makes it a lot less likely when you're filling out your roster as quickly as they have been.
Well, and also, I don't think this would happen at Kansas specifically, but just another example is, as you said, the 16th is just the day that you have until to enter, right? Yep. So guys could still sign after that. Now, obviously, as you said, you want to get signed basically before the academic year starts at the different schools, to where you can enroll and be there for spring football. But, I wouldn't be shocked if we maybe do see on January 14th, January 15th, some bigger name guys potentially be like, you know what, I'm entering right now because I know that all of a sudden I can potentially get paid huge money. I don't think that'll happen at Kansas. And you've seen kind of across the country why a lot of schools have prioritized. You see so many guys tweeting out the social media graphics of, locked in, I'm staying, wherever. Yeah. A lot of that has to do, I think, with eliminating that as a possibility, but it could happen. It could happen. I don't think it'll happen at Kansas, but it could happen at other schools. And so it's still a very, very chaotic period regardless. Wanted to end the show, Kevin, with a little bit of a segment called Where Are They Now?
Oh, nice.
Where Are They Now is players that have entered the portal from Kansas. Where have they gone? Because I think a lot of people, especially in December, as this thing unfolded, you see guys departing, you think, oh my gosh, oh, what a big loss, oh, XYZ, whatever it may be. Well, where are they now? The biggest one is John Kamara. He has committed to Wisconsin. So he's going to be a Badger heading to Wisconsin. Jameel Croft committed to Charlotte. Logan Brantley committed to Boise State. Kene Anine, who is a true freshman offensive lineman this season, committed to North Dakota State. And I think those are the ones that I saw. I don't know if there was any more beyond that, but yeah, I don't know. Just something. I think it's sort of just a fun exercise to see where some of those guys end up going.
Yeah, and Nene's brother was at North Dakota State. He's a defensive end and edge guy. I've actually been keeping an eye on him to see if he enters the portal because I think he's a really good player. But KU's chances there probably aren't as great as when Kene was a Jayhawk. John was entirely predictable. Just you had Jeff Grimes on roster. He saw the type of athlete that John was. And so there were going to be some people outside of the Kansas program who didn't realize that he was that level of freak show athlete. Jeff Grimes had a very real idea of, hey, this is what this guy can do from that standpoint. I like Charlotte a lot for Jameel Croft. You know, Charlotte seems like one of those places that some guys have kind of gone to and then raised their stock up. You know, I like Jameel Croft. I know that he had the bad moment against Kansas State, but I think there's a player there. He just needs to sort of refine the confidence and the things to get there and make himself one. One guy you didn't mention who has not picked a destination, but is getting very highly recruited is Lyric Rawls at this point.
Yeah, Lyric Rawls has, I think, visits to Clemson as well as Tennessee. And look, I think Lyric Rawls certainly has a role, right? I mean, we saw a little bit of what he could do at Kansas, which is he can be that sort of downhill safety that gives you, a major hit in a moment in a game. You think back to like the West Virginia game, he had a huge hit on a receiver. At one point, he had several games where he made big hits. That's sort of his role, right? So that I think, that could be valuable if you're just asking him strictly to do that at a school that's, on that level. So yeah, one to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, I think that typically Kansas hasn't gotten burned a ton by transfers out. A lot of those guys have transferred down. Armage did do really well at Texas A&M. Obviously, is going to be a fairly high draft pick, I feel like, here in the next year. But a lot of those guys have transferred down, haven't wound up being as effective. But I think that's something that you're seeing with the portal explosion and what it is right now is you just can't keep everybody. And, whether it's a money thing, whether it's an opportunity thing, there are going to be guys that you can do everything right. KU could have gone 10-2 this year and done the best job communicating with all these guys. You're still going to lose guys and guys that you wanted. And if you don't believe me, look around the country. I mean, you're seeing some teams still in the college football playoff losing the odd guy that they probably wanted to keep around. And that's just not something that they're able to do. And so you are seeing, maybe some of these guys get a little bit bigger opportunities than previous Jayhawk transfers. But again, I think that's kind of the way things are going throughout college football. We're at 8, Nick, right now. I think, next time we meet to talk football, this thing is going to be well into the double digits and will be interesting to see kind of how some of those need positions are starting to get solved.
Yeah, 100%. This is still a work in progress. Like I said, I think probably in the 20s is going to be the total, I think, for Kansas out of this portal. Yeah. So again, if you think about it from that perspective, you're only maybe a third or 40% of the way there, basically, with what you've done so far. So obviously still a significant amount of work to be done. And also just to put a pin in your comment about, guys transferring out is as we talked about, if you were to make a list of, 5 or 6 guys that you desperately wanted Kansas to retain, they pretty much got all those guys with the exception of like a Trey Lathan probably, right?
Yeah.
Cam Pickett, Leroy Harris, Dak Brinkley, like those were 3 big ones, obviously. that you kept. Jalen Todd is another one.
Herring, yeah.
Amir Herring, so the guys that you wanted to retain, for the most part, you did. And so that's significant for Kansas as well. We're going to be talking Kansas basketball later this week, as well as they have a game tonight. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon, in the early afternoon. So they're going to be taking on TCU tonight. We'll have our breakdown and reaction to that game. Darren Peterson, I'm sure, will be a topic of conversation for that one coming up later this week. We'll talk more transfer portal updates, as well as players continue to sign and commit with Kansas. So you can look for more conversation of us breaking down some of those players coming up later in the week, and also throughout the next couple weeks as well. So all those reasons are more significant reason why you should subscribe to our YouTube channel at Kansas Jocks KCSN, and on our audio platforms on Apple and Spotify. But until next time, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again very soon. Hang on to your hat and try to trust the process with the transfer portal. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.